It was just past 9:30 on the night of September 26, 2014, when the screams ripped through the darkness in Iguala, Guerrero. Gunfire echoed like thunder on pavement slick with fear, and in the chaos, 43 students vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. They were young, idealistic, studying to become teachers at the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College, a school with a revolutionary past and a radical hope. That night, their bus convoy never reached its goal. Instead, it became the epicenter of what would unravel into one of the most haunting human rights tragedies in modern Mexican history. The city's silence in the aftermath wasn't just disturbing, it was suffocating, and beneath that silence pulsed a quiet conspiracy, one that still resists the light a decade later. In the days that followed, the landscape of Iguala transformed into a living tableau of denial and deceit. Official statements shifted by the hour, first a skirmish, then a misunderstanding, then a complete erasure. Local authorities scrambled to paint the students as agitators, while state officials distanced themselves behind veils of plausible denial. But something darker writhed beneath the surface. Families arrived in waves, clutching photographs of sons whose laughter still echoed in the concrete halls of Ayotzinapa. They searched morgues, fields, prisons. They begged. They screamed. But their sons did not return. What they found instead were lies forged in the crucible of corruption, where truth melted into smoke, and in the heart of that smoke, something terrifying began to flicker, evidence of collusion between the police, the military, and the local criminal underworld. The deeper they looked, the darker it got. And no one, it seemed, could be trusted. One witness, a survivor hidden behind layers of anonymity, whispered of men in uniform herding students like cattle, of unmarked vehicles and radios hissing coded commands. Another account told of gunmen who bore no insignia, but moved with military precision. The official line insisted the police had acted alone, but the trajectory of bullets, the intercepted communications, and the conspicuous absence of key security footage all pointed elsewhere. Shadows fell on the 27th Infantry Battalion stationed nearby, accused not by bureaucratic papers, but by trembling testimonies and the torment etched on the mothers' faces. These weren't just missing students, they were symbols suspended in political purgatory, ghost lanterns illuminating the rot hidden for decades. As vigils lit up across the country, protests boiled into the streets with a chant that burned through the walls of power. Vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. But even as the chant roared louder, the silence from above only deepened. In a country long accustomed to the scars of impunity, Ayotzinapa became a wound that refused to close. As the weeks bled into months, the government unveiled its historical truth, a phrase that would become infamous, almost grotesque, in its detachment. The narrative was clinical and cold. The students had been handed over to a local gang, the Guerreros Unidos, who allegedly mistook them for rivals and incinerated their bodies in the Cocula garbage dump. But even ashes tell stories, and investigators, independent ones, not sanctioned by the state, found no trace of the inferno that would have been required. No forensic evidence, no scientific plausibility. Still, officials clung to that narrative like a shield, as if the truth were too volatile to touch, as if these 43 lives, now woven into the national consciousness like brittle silk, could be reduced to a footnote. But the families refused to let the story end like that. In their grief, something tectonic began to stir, an unrelenting, quiet fury that turned mourning into movement, turning mothers and fathers into archivists of truth, into warriors against forgetting. And somewhere far from the microphones, in dusty storage rooms and intercepted radio logs, pieces of the real story continued to hide, trembling under the weight of a decade's silence. The world watched as the fog thickened, but in the quiet corners of Mexico where mountains met cloud and mothers clutched age-worn portraits, a defiance simmered low and constant. In 2015, a glimmer of truth pressed forward when the interdisciplinary group of independent experts, or GIEI, commissioned by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, released a gut-wrenching report. Their findings dismantled the government's historical truth with surgical precision. There was no fire at the dump that night, they declared. No sustained burn powerful enough to erase 43 bodies from this world. Instead, what they unearthed pointed to a deliberate cover-up, orchestrated obstructions, tampered evidence, and grave inconsistencies in testimonies. They found signs of state surveillance, students tracked, victims monitored, and whispering between those lines was the unmistakable implication. The state had not merely failed in protection, it may have participated in the erasure. The narrative, once brittle glass, cracked violently under the weight of truth. And yet, the deeper the experts pushed, the tighter the walls closed in around them, revealing just how far those in power would go to preserve the silence. In clandestine meetings and urgent press briefings, the members of the GIEI detailed how crucial evidence had been coerced, destroyed, or vanished entirely. Witnesses recanted under suspicious circumstances, bruised and broken behind closed doors. Documents critical to the timeline were either redacted beyond recognition or rewritten to obscure military involvement. Journalists chasing the truth were followed, threatened, silenced. It was not just a cover-up, but a finely tuned machinery of obfuscation, greased by fear and impunity. Photographs leaked of soldiers standing idle as students were rounded up mere meters away. On radio frequencies, orders to stand down echoed, while cries for help were intercepted and ignored. Each revelation exposed another layer of the grotesque choreography, a nation not just grieving, but gaslighted. And the mothers, the fathers, they kept coming, year after year, holding placards where their children's smiles never aged, marching in slow, deliberate steps against a system that had tried to erase not just the boys, but the questions. Questions that would not die. Where did the buses really go? Who gave the order? And why did the earth open that night and never close? By 2018, a political shift breathed tentative hope into exhausted hearts. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, newly elected president, promised to uncover the truth. "We will not betray the memory of the Ayotzinapa students," he vowed, his words etched into a storm, churned sky already heavy with promises broken by predecessors. A new investigative commission was created, including members of the families and international advisors. And for a moment, it seemed the machinery of justice might finally grind forward. Mass graves were unearthed across Guerrero, but each discovery was a knife twist of uncertainty, revealing bones, yes, but rarely belonging to the 43. Biology turned into burned hope. DNA reports met with tear-streaked silence. Meanwhile, testimonies emerged from former cartel operatives, now protected witnesses. One revealed a map, hand-drawn in trembling ink, marking clandestine detention sites deep in Iguala. Another named federal officers he claimed were laughing the night the buses were stopped. Yet just as the clouds of decades-long deception began to shift, something colder moved in their place, a reminder that truth in Mexico often sleeps under lock and trigger, waiting for those brave or desperate enough to lift the veil. Then came the betrayal, quiet, sharp, and devastating. In 2022, the special prosecutor leading the case, Omar Gomez Trejo, resigned in protest. He denounced political interference, slow-walked investigations, and intentional sabotage from within the Attorney General's office. Just weeks prior, the government had declared that the disappearance of the 43 was a state crime, a long-withheld truth dropped like a stone in still water. Arrests were announced, including that of the former Attorney General, Jesus Murillo Caram, architect of the historical truth. But behind the headlines, the family sensed a cruel déjà vu. Files suddenly disappeared. Witnesses recanted once more. And most chillingly, the military, whose records were now known to hold vital information, refused to open its archives to full scrutiny. The GIEI's final reports, published before they too were forced out, confirmed what many had feared. Key information was being withheld by the Defense Ministry. Not lost, not misplaced, hidden, deliberately. And once again, the mothers stood on palace steps under gray skies, clutching portraits and prayers, echoing a question that has become both mantra and mourning. ¿Dónde están? Where are they? In the fractured shards of a broken justice system, the families of the Ayotzinapa 43 stood not just as mourners, but as archivists of memory and resistance. Each year, they returned feet blistered, voices hoarse marching through the same streets that had once swallowed their sons, demanding answers that institutions still dared not speak. Mothers kept vigil beside empty beds. Fathers traced routes on aging maps, searching for an ending that remained elusive. Time did not dull their resolve. It only deepened the shadows under their eyes and sharpened the question that haunted every sunrise. How do you grieve when you do not know if death has truly come? And now, a decade later, the fight has taken root in a new generation. Younger siblings speak the names like sacred invocations. Artists carve tributes into city walls. Journalists, undeterred, chase the ghost trail of unspoken truths. The case of the 43 is no longer just a symbol of tragedy. It has become Mexico's unresolved mirror, reflecting both the agony of loss and the undying will to uncover light. Somewhere, perhaps, the boys still wait not just in reality, but in the urgency of memory. And until every shred of truth is unearthed, until silence breaks into confession, the chant will echo beyond time. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. In the stillness left behind, one question looms like a shroud. Who holds the missing seconds of that night, the invisible reel where truth flickers just out of reach? Somewhere, locked in servers guarded by silence and fear, lies footage that could unravel it all. In barracks and archives stamped classified, reports lie dormant, heavy with names some fallen, some exalted. And yet, despite every door slammed, the families carry on, their grief forged into resolve, their sorrow weaponized against forgetfulness. Statues have not been built for the boys, but their faces are monuments etched onto banners, sketched in murals, remembered in protest. 10 years have passed. Presidents have changed. Truth has twisted through courtrooms and collapsed beneath politics. But the questions remain, raw as open wounds. What happened that night in Iguala? Who orchestrated the silence? And how many more years will pass before Mexico dares to answer them? Until then, the streets will keep chanting, the candles will keep burning, and the earth will remember. Because the disappeared are not gone. They are waiting, in silence, in shadow, and in every mother's unrelenting hope. In the heart of Tixla, where the mountains hold their breath and walls bleed murals of remembrance, the Ayotzinapa school endures not just as a learning center, but as a sanctuary of defiance. The dormitories remain Spartan, the paint chipped by time and weather, yet every wall speaks. Desks once shared by the 43 remain untouched, their names carved into wood like ancient runes. New students walk those corridors with reverence, inheriting both a legacy and a burden. They read not from textbooks alone, but from the silences left behind. The unanswered roll calls at morning assemblies. Here, resistance is not a slogan, it is curriculum, and each lesson ends with the same vow passed from one year to the next: never forget, never forgive. The 43 are not just names, they are the question mark that hangs over Mexico's dusk, and until that mark is replaced with truth, Ayotzinapa will keep teaching in defiance, molding not just educators but guardians of memory, the kind that refuses to fade. Far beyond the borders of Mexico, the echoes of Ayotzinapa ripple through courtrooms, classrooms, and corridors of power. International human rights bodies have cited the case as emblematic of structural violence and institutional decay. The United Nations and Amnesty International have both condemned the obstruction of justice, labeling it a stain not just on Mexico's governance, but on the conscience of the global community. In Argentina, Chile, Colombia, nations too familiar with forced disappearances, solidarity protests erupt with haunting familiarity. The faces of the 43 have been carried through rain-slick streets in Berlin, held high in candlelight vigils across New York. Their story has become more than a national tragedy. It is a universal cry against the machinery of disappearance. Yet amid this global resonance, the weight still falls heaviest on the mothers left behind. They sleep in shifts, they reread transcripts, They memorize timelines like scripture, and with every passing day, their search does not become easier, it becomes holier, because in every withheld file, every soldier's silence, every faded photo, lies a single unrelenting truth. To forget the 43 would be to let disappearance become destiny. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the streets are still and grief feels loudest, there is a sound nearly imperceptible to the outside world, pages turning, lips whispering names, sandals brushing pavement in rhythm with remembrance. This is how the resistance continues, not with explosions, but with endless refusal. Refusal to let the 43 be reduced to case numbers or bureaucratic failures. Refusal to normalize the vanishing of life into oblivion. In Ayotzinapa, the names are not just remembered, they are guarded like sacred fire passed between trembling hands. And in this act of guarding, the world is challenged to confront not just the crime, but its complicity in silence. Because forced disappearance is never just a moment, it is an echo that can stretch across generations, a scar handed down from mother to child. 10 years on, the wound still bleeds, but within that blood, a promise endures. They will not be forgotten. Not today. Not ever. Because memory, in the end, is the weapon that outlives the lie. There is a tree on the outskirts of Iguala, where mothers tie ribbons, one for each year past, one for each hope unfulfilled. Its trunk is thick with time, its branches bent like grieving arms. They say if you stand there long enough, you can hear the names whispered by the wind, carried from mountains to morgues to memories. And under that tree, in the dry soil watered only by tears, something endures, not closure, not peace, but an oath carved deeper than grief that even if the state forgets, if the world turns away, if power rewrites the past again and again, the mothers will remember. The brothers will remember. The soil itself will remember. Because scars are not just what pain leaves behind. Sometimes, they are the only maps back to truth. So the march continues. Forward through silence. Forward through lies. Toward the truth, buried in ash and rumor. Toward the 43. Always toward the 43. In a dusty office, tucked behind layers of bureaucracy in Mexico City, there remains a locked drawer. No one dares open its contents, rumored, never confirmed, to include original testimonies, command logs, and perhaps a missing link that binds the scattered truths into one unbearable conclusion. Whispers say the drawer belonged to someone long reassigned, sidelined for asking the wrong questions. Yet still it sits, a silent cenotaph to the narrative never permitted to breathe. Around it gathers the silence of clerks who look away, of secretaries who know too much, and of archivists who pray they are never asked to choose between country and conscience. And beyond these chambers of reluctant memory, the hills near Ayotzinapa still echo with names. The families, their steps now heavier, their candles flickering more fiercely, do not speak of closure anymore. They speak of continuation, of becoming the very clock that never stops ticking. Because somewhere, not just in files and forests, but in living breath and unburied questions, the 43 still exist not merely as ghosts, but as demands. Demands that will keep rising with the dawn, etched in sky and soil, until truth is no longer inconvenient, but undeniable. Beneath the weight of disbelief and dread, a new murmur rises, one not born of grief, but of reckoning. In the decades since that night swallowed the 43, the mechanisms of power have been laid bare, not just in what they did, but what they allowed, what they concealed. The students did not vanish in isolation, they were made to disappear by a system stitched together by complicity, silence, and terror. But systems built on fear eventually feed upon themselves, unraveling thread by delicate thread. Now, silently, that unraveling has begun. There are teachers still whispering the students' names in class, activists carving their silhouettes into every wall defaced by indifference, and investigators who, despite sanction or threat, keep files unlocked under sleepless eyes. The truth has not surfaced because it is lost. It remains hidden because it is known, protected by those who fear its power. But fear, like fog, doesn't hold forever. And when it lifts, Even for a moment, there will be no turning back. The 43 will no longer be a question. They will be the answer Mexico was too afraid for too long to face. In the distance, a single trumpet plays over the hills of Guerrero, a mournful tune echoing through dusk, half dirge, half call to arms. Time has passed, but memory has not aged. Each September, the clock rewinds in the hearts of mothers, of brothers, of classmates still walking footsteps interrupted by gunshots. Justice remains suspended in shadows, but the demand for it has become a lifeline, binding communities battered by corruption into unlikely sanctuaries of resilience. The Ayotzinapa 43 may never return to their desks, their laughter perhaps never to echo through those concrete halls again. Yet in every protest chant, every investigation clawed from unwilling hands, every child who asks why 43 hearts stopped beating together in the night, there they are. Present. Witnesses. Symbols. Wounds. And until the last name is spoken in truth and not as question, Mexico itself will remain incomplete, because the vanished don't fade. They wait, carved into the soul of a nation still learning how to tell the truth. And so the story of the 43 does not end in a courtroom or in the ink of a final report, but in the daily insistence that they matter still. In schoolyards where young boys no older than they were once dream of teaching, in places like Ayotzinapa, in kitchens where mothers stir pots and speak of justice as if it were an ingredient not yet found. In hearts that beat with the rhythm of loss, but also of refusal. Refusal to be complicit. Refusal to allow disappearance to define destiny. The dust has not settled, because the questions remain alive, urgent, burning, not as whispers, but as an unending chorus across the valleys of Guerrero and the chambers of conscience worldwide. Somewhere out there, where silence once reigned, truth is beginning to rise slow, searing, unstoppable. And when it comes, it will bear the faces of 43 young men, eyes alight not from life lost, but from a light relit by 10 years of defiance. A decade has passed. A movement has formed. And one day, maybe not soon, but certainly, Mexico will answer the question that has haunted its nights for too long. Where are they? They're here. In the fight. In the memory. In the truth that refuses to stay buried. In the decade since the earth swallowed the Ayotzinapa 43, their absence has stitched itself into the moral fabric of a nation struggling between denial and reckoning. What began as a horror eventually bloomed into a doctrine of resistance, passed hand to trembling hand, from victims to visionaries. 10 years of mourning turned into 10 years of movement. Schools have renamed classrooms after the boys. Filmmakers and poets immortalize them in films and verse. New laws bear their shadow, and still, the mothers walk, always forward, always searching not only for bodies, but for the soul of a country fractured by systemic cruelty. The 43 now live in the questions that refuse to die, in the silences that thunder louder than speeches, and as another September nears, the wind carries the same unrelenting vow etched into every banner, every chant, every lifted fist. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And until that echo meets an answer, until memory becomes justice, until silence breaks into truth, this story will remain unfinished. Yes, but never forgotten. A decade on, the story of the 43 remains not a frozen chapter, but a living pulse, steady, haunting, and defiant. In every corner of Mexico, their legacy lingers like candle smoke after a vigil, weightless yet inescapable. Streets that once looked away now speak their names in graffiti and song. Children born after 2014 ask about them as if they were brothers lost, not strangers. And though the names of perpetrators may yet elude the ink of justice, the names of the 43 have been etched into something even more enduring: collective conscience. The case is no longer merely legal but spiritual. It moves through the veins of culture, justice, and memory, not as a relic, but as a reckoning. And as Mexico stands at the edge of its own reflection, there remains one undying truth. The fate of the 43 is not just about finding answers to the past. It is about deciding who this country dares to become next. Though investigators come and go, though governments change and commissions dissolve, the story of the 43 refuses to leave. It clings to every omission, every refusal to open a file, every press conference that sidesteps names and times. It is the haunting refrain Mexico cannot silence, the wound it keeps covering with decorum but which bleeds through nonetheless. And while the nation wrestles with its identity caught between denial and awakening, a new generation begins to rise, one born of tragedy, yet shaped by the fervent will to confront it. They carry cameras instead of fear. They wield facts like torches in the dark. For them, Ayotzinapa is not a past to mourn, but a future to reckon with, proof that even when history crushes, people can rise not in the absence of despair, but through it. And in that rise, the boys are there watching, waiting, leading not from behind, but from within the movement their deaths unwillingly ignited. This is not the end. It is the continuation of memory turned into fire. They were sons, students, dreamers. Now they are symbols, sanctified by injustice and immortalized through sorrow. Their story is spoken not only in chants, but in the quiet courage of families who have learned to breathe beneath the weight of disbelief. The soil of Guerrero hides many things: bones, truths, betrayals, but it also grows resistance. And this resistance, seeded by 43 stolen futures, blooms stronger with every name spoken out loud. Ayotzinapa was not just a place, but a breaking point. A mirror shattered across a continent, reflecting not only what was done, but what must now be undone. In the end, it was not the military, the cartels, or the politics that defined the legacy of the 43. It was the mothers who refused silence, the fathers who chose truth over fear, and a nation that, in the ruins of its shame, found the courage to hope again. 10 years on, the 43 are not lost. They are calling. And the world finally has begun to listen. And still, the road winds on past checkpoints and candles, past bureaucrats and barricades, carried by a truth too unsettling to be buried. In Mexico's plazas, on grainy protest flyers, across murals weathered by sun and time, their eyes remain. Not eyes that accuse, but eyes that wait. Eyes that ask. After all the commissions, the marches, the reports, both silenced and screamed, one question still pulses louder than any answer given: how can a nation move forward while its children remain missing? The story of the 43 does not seek to reopen wounds. It is the wound, the one that will not scab over, that bleeds with every denied file, every politician's broken vow. And yet, even in this unhealed pain, there is a strange kind of grace, because while the graves may remain unmarked, and the truth still clawed from darkness, the legacy of the 43 has given birth to something undeniable: a people who refuse to forget. A decade has passed. The silence tried to win, but memory was louder. In the final silence of their absence, the 43 are no longer merely a tragedy to reckon with. They are a compass pointing toward the soul of a country still searching for itself. Justice remains elusive, yes, but hope hardened, weathered, relentless survives in every candle carried through rain, in every name rattled through protest megaphones, in every mother's refusal to yield. Mexico's history has long danced with shadows, but Ayotzinapa demands light, total, brutal, blinding truth. And until that light finds every crevice where fear once festered, the 43 will not rest, nor will those who walk in their names. Because this story is not just about the past, it is about shaping a future where no one disappears without echo, where memory becomes action, and where silence never wins. And so the story of Ayotzinapa closes not with an ending, but with a vow etched into sky, stone, and soul. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And through that demand, a nation begins to awaken. There are moments in history when a nation chooses whether it will be remembered for its cowardice or its courage. Ayotzinapa is one such moment. 10 years have passed, and though the darkness still clings to the edges of this story, the fire lit by those families has not dimmed, it has spread. Through whispered prayers and courtroom battles, through mistrust and mourning, the echo of those stolen voices resounds across time. This is not only a tribute to the fallen, but a reckoning for the living, a reminder that truth is not a luxury but a necessity, that memory is not weakness but resistance. And though the names may never be spoken from an official podium, though justice may yet stumble on its way to dawn, one fact remains eternal. The 43 are not gone. They are here, in every heartbeat that refuses to forget, in every step taken toward light, in every voice that rises against silence. The night of Iguala will not be the end. It will be the beginning of a country that chooses, at last, to remember with purpose. 10 years on, the march continues, toward truth, toward justice, toward the 43. And so, under the weight of a decade's grief and an ocean of unanswered questions, the story of the 43 settles deep into the marrow of Mexico's becoming, not as a scar, but as a vow threaded through generations. This final refrain does not ask for pity, but persistence. It is not just about the voices silenced that night in Iguala, but about what echoes in the silence they left behind. Their names, once whispered over vigil fires, have become the rhythm of a movement that defies forgetting. And when the day comes, because it must, when truth is unearthed from beneath rubble, both literal and political, when the final file is opened and the last lie pierced, that day will not belong to institutions. It will belong to the mothers, the students, the country grieved into awakening. Because the 43 were not just taken. They were transformed into memory that fights back, into history that refuses closure, into light that does not flicker. A candle for each of them still burns, and until justice walks the streets where they last stood, the chant will continue to rise, relentless and incorruptible. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. In the growing hush that follows decades of noise, one truth remains immovable as stone. Ayotzinapa was never just about the 43. It is about every name missing from a roll call, every file marked confidential, every voice stifled by fear. It is about a nation's reckoning with itself, dragged from shadow to storm to light. For some, the search continues in courts and mass graves. For others, it endures in verse, art, and unyielding memory. And if the story of the disappeared students closes at all, it is not with silence but with the unrelenting echo of a people who refuse to look away. 10 years on, they are no longer only sons, victims, or headlines. They are markers of a dark night that demanded dawn. And though justice walks with a limp, and the truth arrives in fragments, the promise endures. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And somewhere between those two lines, history bends not in surrender, but toward justice at last. Above the Ayotzinapa campus, the sky sometimes shifts strange colors at dusk, crimson soaked into slate, like an old bruise blooming anew. Locals say it's the earth remembering their names, remembering the night. The school bell rings, not just to mark time, but to mark resilience. Here, education is a ritual of defiance, every chalk stroke a summons against forgetting. What endures is not closure. Closure remains a ghost. What endures is the refusal, a refusal to surrender their story to archives or footnotes. For as long as voices rise in protest, as long as candles burn into the wind, as long as murals breathe color into cold stone, the Ayotzinapa 43 remain present, not lost to time, but stitched into its very fabric. They are Mexico's vigil, its reckoning, its undying heartbeat beneath denial. And in every step taken toward truth, no matter how slow, how painful they lead, always they lead. Somewhere, in the folds of dusty files and half-erased names, a breakthrough waits, not because time has made it clearer, but because persistence has made it undeniable. A recently declassified document, buried beneath years of bureaucratic indifference, surfaces with a name long whispered in the shadows. A mid-level commander stationed in Iguala, the night the sky collapsed. His sign-off appears on a dispatch log sent just minutes before the students disappeared. All units divert to Zone 7. Stand by for consolidation. Until now, Zone 7 was a mystery, a coordinate wiped clean from official records. But independent researchers following this thread have located it a disused facility on the outskirts of Cocula, ringed by barbed wire and memory. Soil samples match those found on the students' clothing. Charred remnants indicate a fire smaller than the state claimed, but real. It's not closure, not yet. But it is a fracture in the wall. A space for truth to breathe. And though the dust still settles in uneven silence, that breath might be the beginning of what so many died waiting for, not just answers, but reckoning. The cracks deepen. Investigative teams, newly emboldened, trace the dispatch to a chain of encrypted messages between outposts. Patterns begin to form, phrases repeated with eerie precision, locations lined up like ghosts along an abandoned route. The names are no longer buried behind black bars. They are alive in emails and call logs, marked with times that match the hour the students entered darkness. A forensic drone, flown over Zone 7, captures heat anomalies beneath the soil. When dug, it reveals remnants, clothing fibers, scorched fragments, strands of hope still clinging to decay. Parents are notified with trembling lips, unsure whether this is another trap, another false grave, or the long-awaited breach in the shield of impunity. Cameras film not for spectacle, but for accountability. Behind closed doors, once silent voices begin to murmur to investigators, trading immunity for release from memory's chokehold. The silence, for the first time, cracks not from protest, but from truth fighting its way out. And just beyond reach, almost visceral now, the presence of the 43 not gone, not forgotten presses against history's surface, daring it to finally speak. So it comes to this, a decade's descent into darkness, now pierced by a single sliver of light. The truth is not whole, not yet, but visible like dawn, bleeding through the cracks of a long-locked door. Families gather once more at the gates of Ayotzinapa, candles in hand, eyes unblinking, hearts unwilling to close. Because now, with evidence in hand and silence caving under the weight of relentless memory, the country stands at another threshold, one final chance to choose honesty over omission, courage over comfort. The 43 are close, almost audible in the hush before justice speaks, and when it does, when that day bursts through like thunder upon the mountains, it will not be marked by a single moment, but by every mother who refused to surrender, every answer torn from the grip of silence, every step carved into history by those too broken to stop. What happened in Iguala was a crime. What followed was a conspiracy. But what remains, what endures, is a promise. One louder than denial, longer than pain, and stronger than fear. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And now, finally, the world begins to listen, not with pity, but with purpose. This is not the end. It is the reckoning the 43 always deserved. And in this narrow corridor of reckoning, where truth finally begins to draw breath, Mexico stands suspended between what was endured and what must now be answered. The names of the 43 are no longer questions. They are testaments, etched not just into banners or granite, but into the nation's DNA. A people who stood vigil for 10 years have shattered the illusion that forgetting could ever be an option. In every municipality that once turned a blind eye, in every judiciary office that once feared the cost of honesty, the echoes now reverberate. Truth is no longer a threat, it is the path forward. And as the dust of doubt settles, footsteps press firmly into ground made sacred by resistance. For the mothers, for the fathers, for every student whose shadow stretched into night and never returned at dawn. This is Mexico's hour of reckoning, not just to find the disappeared, but to find itself. And until the last truth is spoken aloud, until the last silence is broken, the chant remains not a plea but a vow. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And so the candle burns low, but it does not go out. In the hearts of Ayotzinapa's survivors, in the recorders of rebel memory, and in every square where justice was once only whispered, a new wind stirs. It carries the voices of those who dared wait, those who wept without surrender, those who made memory a form of protest. 10 years have not silenced the story, they have deepened its roots, made its truth harder to distract from, and strengthened its place among the chronicles that define a people. The 43 were stolen, hidden, denied. But they were never erased. For to be remembered with such fury, such clarity, such love, this is a resurrection against forgetting. Their absence has reshaped a nation's pulse, and as Mexico steps forward, unsteady but unafraid, it does so carrying their names like torches. This is their legacy. This is the monument they etched with their vanishing. Not in stone, but in soul. They were taken alive. We want them back alive, and that truth, burning eternal, will guide the way home. Somewhere, perhaps in the crumpled pages of official denials or the soot-streaked walls of an abandoned facility, the final clue waits not as an answer, but as a mirror, because the truth of Ayotzinapa was never buried beneath a single lie, it was scattered, like embers, across an entire landscape of complicity. And now, as Mexico edges toward an uncertain reckoning, that landscape has begun to light. Not in flames, but in memory. The kind of memory too brave to blink, too sacred to betray. The 43 walk now as legacy, as warning, as promise. Their absence was always a question. But their persistence is the answer. The story never belonged to the state, nor to the silence. It belongs to the march, to the candle, to the chorus that will not fade. 10 years have passed. Suffering became scripture. Resistance became ritual. And truth, long exiled, begins to return. Slow, radiant, unyielding. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And through these words, repeated into the centuries, they will live forever. In the end, Ayotzinapa is more than an atrocity, it is an altar. An altar forged not by priests or presidents, but by mothers who left fear behind and chose fire instead. Their steps have traced a decade-long pilgrimage, through denial, through ridicule, through danger. And with each step, the lie unravels a little more. The nation may still hesitate before the mirror. Governments may still falter before the weight of truth, but the people no longer do. They carry the 43 in posters, in poems, in whispered prayers before sleep. They carry them in questions asked in classrooms and graffiti scrawled on walls that refuse to forget. 10 years on, the state still parses evidence and guards files, but the people have already delivered a verdict. They will never move on, because to move on would be to surrender. And to surrender would be to lose not only the 43, but ourselves. So the march continues, one foot in memory, one in justice, not toward closure, but toward an awakening where the names are no longer shadows, but beacons. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And so long as that vow is spoken, they are not gone. They are here present, eternal, guiding Mexico not only toward truth, but toward itself. And here, at the edge of rage and remembrance, a final truth emerges, not carved into monuments or decreed in courtrooms, but whispered in every language of loss, defiance, and undying love. The Ayotzinapa 43 were not actors in a brief tragedy, not symbols conjured for political theater. They were sons who laughed loudly, dreamed stubbornly, and believed fiercely in a country that betrayed them. Yet from that betrayal sprang a resolve larger than justice itself, a resolve that breathed into marches, ignited art, and echoed through every corner where voices rise against disappearance. The earth may never yield every secret. The state may never confess every complicit hand. But 10 years on, the legacy stands firm. They lit a fire, and that fire, kept alive by mothers who refuse silence and a people who refuse surrender, will keep burning until the last veil is lifted, until lies are laid bare, until absence speaks truth. This is Ayotzinapa, not a memory fading, but a flame enduring. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And through that sacred insistence, they live, Always, they live. So as the sky darkens over Guerrero once more, and the bells at Ayotzinapa chime into another year etched by absence, we stand at the precipice of remembrance and reckoning, not as distant observers, but as bearers of a story that now belongs to all of us. We carry their names not just in mourning, but in motion and ink that refuses erasure, in chants that dare the silence to speak, in memory turned unbreakable armor. This is not merely the end of a tale weighed down by sorrow, but the beginning of a legacy carried forward by hands that refuse to let go. In every truth unearthed, in every march unyielding, in every mural that blooms from walls once blank, the Ayotzinapa 43 rise not as victims, but as visionaries of a justice still in the making. 10 years have not dimmed their light. They have multiplied it. And so we say it once more, with voices both trembling and unshakable. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And until the earth answers, we remember, we resist, we remain. And thus the final page turns, not in silence, but in the soft thunder of memory that refuses to be erased. Ayotzinapa is no longer a question for Mexico alone. It is a parable for the world, a haunting reminder of what happens when truth is bartered for power, and when lives are weighed against the machinery of fear. But beneath the layers of bureaucracy, and beneath the soil that still clings to unanswered prayers, the 43 remain unaltered, unwavering. Their story is not defined by disappearance, but by presence, by the fire they sparked in every soul unwilling to forget. 10 years on, justice may still walk in shadows, but hope walks beside it, holding 43 names like torches in the dusk. And when the day comes that history dares to meet memory with honesty, it will not begin with a declaration but with a whisper, rising from murals, valleys, and tears. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And through those words, not even time can bury them. They endure. They guide. They wait. So let the final frame linger not on the tragedy alone, but on the tenacity it gave birth to. Let the story end not with silence, but with a breath held across 1,000 towns, as if the entire country pauses to listen, once more, for footsteps that never returned but still echo in its soul. In the memory of the 43, Mexico has found a spine it never thought it had a resolve, that bends, breaks, and still stands. And while the questions remain, so does the movement they ignited. A movement built not from answers received, but from the relentless asking. Let the fire they lit continue to surge down every street, through every heart, across every map scarred by impunity. Because this is not just a remembrance, it is a reclamation of truth. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And so long as breath fills the lungs of those who remember, that truth will never die. It will march, it will burn, it will lead the way home. And with that, the last candle flickers in the wind but does not go out. Its flame joins the thousands that came before it, each a defiant speck of light in a landscape once drowned by complicity. The names of the Ayotzinapa 43 remain unyielding, braided into language, into murals, into lullabies, sung by those too young to remember but shaped forever by their absence. This final breath of story is not closure, but a call, a heartbeat laid bare, pulsing beneath the dust of withheld justice. Let history record what power feared to say. They are more than missing. They are memory turned marrow. They are grief, transfigured into flame. They are truth, waiting. And for as long as voices rise to carry their names across valleys, courtrooms, and generations, the promise will endure, etched beyond denial, beyond forgetting. They were taken alive. We want them back alive. And though the night lingers, morning approaches, they lead us still into the light.